If you want to learn more about the topics of today's episode, visit the podcast website at naturesecretservice.com. Thanks for listening. Okay, people, listen up. Here we go. This is Nature's Secret Service, the podcast that puts you in the room with the men and women of wildlife law enforcement. I'm Ed Newcomer, your host, and today our guest is Mark Madison, a historian at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, located at the National Conservation Training Center, NCTC. Mark, thank you so much for being on the episode. I've been looking forward to having you on as a guest for a long time.
Me too.
We had a little bit of a hiccup there with the government shutdown. You were scheduled to be on a while ago, but we had to delay. But you're here now, and that's all that matters. Mark, as you know, I was a special agent for many years, and I did not even know that there was a historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service until one day I was at NCTC for one of our special agent in-service programs, and I don't know how it came to my attention, but down in the basement below the auditorium is your offices and your archives, and maybe you came to speak to us, I don't know, but you invited us to go down there. So I just went down and met you and looked around, and it's astonishing. It's amazing. It's very cool what you've done down there. Tell the listeners and watchers, I introduced you as a historian. What do you do? What do you do down there at NCTC?
Good question. Nobody knows. I was hidden around underground. I've actually moved to another building. I'm above grade level, but there's no windows still.
Okay.
And in 1999, Fish and Wildlife Service decided to hire their first historian. And if I don't screw it up, hopefully there'll be more in the future. And the primary thing I do, which you mentioned, Ed, and you saw, is manage the archives and museum. So we have the Fish and Wildlife Service Archives and Museum out here. And since we opened them in 1997, we've gotten about 500,000 items in the archives. And I'd have to say probably the division that's given us the most is Fish and Wildlife Service Law Enforcement. The archives are full of law enforcement, historic artifacts, confiscated items, things that tell the story about Nature's Secret Service, basically. We also do displays out here, and then I give historic talks to a number of the courses out here to tell our Fish and Wildlife Service folks about how the agency came into being, maybe how their program, be it law enforcement or migratory birds or refuges, came into being. And I have to say, you've seen where I worked. It's the best job in the world. I have, unlike most archives. So I'm a PhD historian. I did research, and all the archives I went to was a world of paper.
Yes.
Just tons and tons of paper. Thanks to law enforcement, our archives has rhino heads,
right,
bejeweled daggers, elephant tusks, all sorts of fascinating things, not to mention a lot of historic things that go back to 1900 that are wonderful to tell stories about, teach us a little about our history, and explain why law enforcement is really important over the last 126 years, at least at the federal level.
Yeah. And, like you said, you have tangible things in your archives. Yeah. And one of the things I was so fascinated with is some of the things you have are equipment that was used by agents 50, 60 or more years ago. And, as an investigator myself who had the advantage of having sophisticated equipment of my era, it's so interesting to see what other agents had that would have been sophisticated equipment of their era, right? Which is really cool. I'm so happy that it's there, and I'm so happy you've taken an interest in documenting it. Correct me if I'm wrong. I have always told people, I believe it to be true, but you'll know, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service courses under the U.S. Department of Interior. And right. I'll ask you in a second to explain the different names that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has had over the years. But it's one of the oldest law enforcement agencies in the United States. It has many functions, but one of the functions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is law enforcement. And that goes back or at least the 1900, right? I mean,
Yeah, with the
can you?
Lacey Act in 1900.
Yeah,
That's usually where I trace the origin point, is
yeah.
1900.
I think that is the first place that it said, our officers of that agency have law enforcement authority under the Lacey Act. So, can you kind of explain the historical name changes and that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has
I'll try.
experienced?
I'll try.
Okay.
So we began way back in 1871 as the Fish Commission. So our agency was founded right after the Civil War. The
Mm,
Fish Commission was chartered by President Ulysses S. Grant. So that gives you a context. It literally was right after the Civil War. And
amazing.
then there was a parallel agency that was in charge of all wildlife that's not a fish called the Biological Survey. And eventually, those two bureaus, the Bureau of Fisheries is what the Fish Commission was called eventually, and the Bureau of Biological Survey were combined in 1940 to make the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is why we have a redundant name because fish is a type of wildlife. It's kind of a historical relic, just like all the artifacts we were talking about. But our law enforcement function um, began in both agencies. There were actually fish law enforcement agents who tried to uh, protect fish and maintain some federal regulations on fish. But the more substantive one where we trace our roots to was in the Biological Survey. And Biological Survey began its federal wildlife protection with the Lacey Act, an act that was proposed by John Lacey in Iowa. The Midwest is going to play a big role in our historic talks today, which is good. I'm from the Midwest. We
That's
always
for
claim
sure.
we're the most important history area. Um, so it began in 1900, and our first folks who did law enforcement were called Lacey agents or Lacey inspectors. And it's actually somewhat similar. I don't know if you've had any wildlife inspectors on, but it's similar to what they do,
Hmm.
except today our wildlife inspectors are often at seaports and airports and so on. The Lacey inspectors were at railroad junctions, and that's where poachers were shipping illegally poached wildlife to major urban areas, New York, Chicago, and so on. So these Lacey agents would hang out at railroad junctions and catch poachers shipping passenger pigeons or any other species to urban markets illegally after the Lacey Act was passed. Eventually, in the 1920s, we went through a variety of names. We went through game wardens. My favorite was game protector.
Hmm.
I thought that was kind of a charming name.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and then U.S. Game agent became a popular one, although we were informally known as duck cops because, as we'll talk about later, um, it was as migratory birds were kind of a critical part of our function, particularly migratory waterfowl, until the present, when we have a variety of names, special agents, wildlife inspectors, and so on. And they're also in the early years, the refuge officers, the refuge law enforcement wing,
Right.
uh, was part of that too. And we were talking about the archives. We have images of Lacey agents going back to 1900,
Oh, awesome.
confiscating tundra swans, confiscating other swans from Chesapeake Bay, and so on. And they're wearing fedoras, and they look like they're from the 1900s, all the way up to sadly 9/11. We have Rich Guadagno's badge out here, who died on Flight 93. So
Right.
the archive, the museum, kind of covers the whole trajectory of the last 126 years, at least, of federal wildlife law enforcement.
That is amazing. I'm definitely going to mine you for some of those photos that I can put on the website associated with this episode because we are going to go back in time a little bit
Yeah.
to talk about some specific officers that you know about, and one that I know about. The thing that I think is worthwhile talking about before that, though, is you mentioned market hunting and for listeners and watchers to get an understanding of what was going on in the country at that time. Correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, the U.S. was kind of its food sources were changing,
Yes.
and instead now moving toward a more of a modern agricultural style production of food supply, but there was this tremendous demand for wild meat from the Midwest and the West to supply the big markets and restaurants in Chicago, New York, all the big cities on the East
Yeah.
Coast. And a lot of that wildlife was wild. I mean, it was wild. The game meat coming in was wild, and it was being poached at unbelievable levels, taken at unbelievable levels in the West. For let me ask you to describe something. A punt gun. Describe what a punt gun is, and this
Yeah.
I think it'll give people an understanding of the kind of decimation that was happening in our wildlife populations just to supply these markets on the central and east coast.
That's a great one. We have about three punt guns back here, and they basically look like cannons.
Right.
They weigh 50 to 75 pounds. You couldn't carry them into a blind or anything. They were hard mounted on a small boat, a punt boat, hence their name. And basically, you shot them into a flock of waterfowl, and you could kill 50 or 60 at a time. And clearly, you weren't doing that for your own pantry. That was to be sold to urban markets, and we have old menus showing what these New York and Chicago restaurants were serving, and the menus are basically all wild game. And the problem with that was it made a lot of species highly endangered and threatened. It even made one species, the passenger pigeon, which was largely hunted for food and then shipped by rail to urban markets, extinct. So it had a huge impact, and anything you could eat, be it a mammal or a bird, the numbers just crashed
Yeah.
in the late 1800s. I mean, it's hard to imagine today, but things like Canada geese, wild turkeys, you just didn't see anymore on the East Coast or the Midwest. They just been hunted nearly to extinction. So it really decimated the nation's resources. So shortly after the Civil War, America decided, our next battle was going to be to save America's wildlife, and law enforcement was the first major tool that we used to do it.
Yeah, and law enforcement, I think, plays a super important role in protecting species, preventing them from going endangered or extinct. And part of that is giving them what I've always described as the breathing room they need
Yeah,
to recover, right? And with these punt guns, for example, we're targeting ducks and geese.
yeah,
And as those animals, we've talked before on this podcast with other guests about flyways and migratory routes of migratory birds. And, they may gather in a field by the tens of thousands.
right,
And, you know, a half a dozen poachers out there with boats and punt guns can probably decimate half the ducks there and half the geese there in just a few days. And that has significant impact on their ability to breed, feed, migrate. You're taking out a lot of animals from the environment in a very short period of time. And you mentioned the passenger pigeon. People always remember the huge herds of wild buffalo and bison that used to
yeah.
roam across the United States. But the passenger pigeon, I believe, was considered maybe the most numerous wild animal in the United
It
States.
was
Yeah,
maybe the world, the most
maybe the
populous
world.
avian species probably ever to exist,
Right.
and it was hunted to extinction through this
Gone.
type of market hunting. And market hunters, game hogs. There were people that weren't sportsmen. They weren't
Right.
sports hunters going out to shoot a goose for Christmas or at the family table. They were in it for the profit, and they didn't care what happened to the species. And Ed, you bring up a good point. A lot of these punt guns come from places like the Chesapeake Bay, so these are choke points
Mm.
where you get you know uh, over the course of a migratory period, millions of birds in this one area that you can just decimate. The Gulf of Mexico, where they congregated along the Mississippi, along these flyways, is where the poachers congregated. And what really did them in was rails. When the Transcontinental Railroad was built, when the nation was connected by rails, suddenly you could slaughter a lot more birds and get them quickly to urban markets and really make a profit without them spoiling and so on. And that's really what did them in and threatened to do in a whole slew of other species. You mentioned bison around here where I am in West Virginia. Amazing as it is today to consider it, there weren't any white-tailed deer left. They've been hunted out.
What?
Most of the white-tailed deer that we have in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and these places, which where they're ubiquitous now, came
Right.
from Michigan. They were transplanted. They just hunted them out of the area. It's mind-boggling. Canada geese. We have
Yeah.
so many of them now. You see them migrating. I saw them today when I went on a walk for lunch. They were removed largely from the East Coast and had to be brought back. So it was around 1900, around the time of the Lacey Act. It really was a low point for
Yeah.
American wildlife, and people were concerned. It was the future generations be able to see wildlife, be able to engage in traditional sports like deer hunting and duck hunting for the next generation, unless something changed.
Yeah, and we certainly do not want to repeat history, right? So
No,
these animals may appear to be very, like you said, ubiquitous. I can never say that word.
populous.
There's a lot of them. There's a lot of
Yeah,
them, but
right.
it may seem like there are a lot of them now, but you got to remember, just yeah, not too long ago they were pretty hard to find, and we had to actually spend a lot of our, money, our government money to reintroduce a lot of these animals.
Yep.
And one of the things that really struck me when you just said that it was not about poaching to put food on your table.
No.
It was poaching for money. And,
Yep.
and that is something 100 and now 25 years later, that's still the driver be, behind wildlife trafficking. It's money, it's greed. And, it's so interesting to me that the wildlife protectors and Lacey agents of, 1900 to 1930s were chasing people who were driven by the same greed and money lust that we're chasing today. Special
You'll
agents.
see a lot of similarities
Yeah.
historically
Mm.
between the type of people that engage in these illegal activities, between the reason they do it. You mentioned profit, and even some of the techniques we use to capture them. So
Yeah.
history isn't just timelines or boring old facts. There's lessons to be learned, and also a pride in being part of an organization that has ensured that you and I can still see deer and turkey, Canada geese, which it was questionable. We can't
Yeah.
see passenger pigeons. We can't
No.
see auks. We can't see a number of species that Carolina parakeets, ivory-billed woodpeckers that are gone.
Right.
But we saved most of them, and that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to talk now about a guy named John Perry who came from this era, a little bit late, not
Yes.
1900, but a little later. Actually, interesting era in terms of law enforcement and crime in the United States, and he's one of the most interesting characters, and he's a great example of. You mentioned a lot of the same techniques we use today were used then to catch bad guys, and one of the things I always tried to remind new agents of is that the most important skill you've got is good old fashioned detective work. It doesn't matter if you don't necessarily need night vision. You don't necessarily need the most sophisticated equipment. Detective skills have been around for hundreds of years,
Right.
and a good detective who's willing to get out on the street and put the shoe leather time in to go interview people, do surveillance, see what's going on, collect records is way ahead of the guy who's just sitting in the dark with a pair of night vision goggles trying to watch something. It's you can detective skills are the key, and if those are perfected any era, you're going to be fine.
You're
So,
right.
yeah,
Absolutely. The most important law enforcement tool is your brain.
is your
It
brain?
really is. Yeah, we'll see a lot of innovations
Yeah,
over the years, and those aren't coming because they bought best tool. It's because they came up with a new technique to catch these folks. And then
yeah,
the poachers, the criminals, their techniques are always changing, so we have to evolve with them.
yes, but yet apply those basic detective skills that have
Yep.
worked for detectives going back hundreds of years. So let's talk about John Perry a little bit. In the kind of timeline of different titles of wildlife officers for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where does John Perry fall in this? What was his title?
He was he was a game protector at the time, which was our name in the 1920s.
Love it.
And John Perry's one of my favorite
Me too.
law enforcement agents. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the laws, but that kind of makes your eyelids start to droop and so on. But it's the people, right? People have to
Yeah.
enforce them. People have to be innovative. So John Perry is a law enforcement agent in the state of Illinois in the 1920s. And anybody that's seen the Untouchables and Elliot Ness, that was a tough time to be any type of federal law enforcement agent because during Prohibition, there was an explosion of gang activity, primarily involved in bootlegging. And the center point of it was Chicago. There's a reason the Untouchables took place in Chicago because that's where the big gangs were. Dillinger, Al Capone, they were all in the Illinois area.
Right.
Its proximity to Canada and illegal booze made it a hotbed of crime. It was also by far the toughest place to be a federal wildlife agent. It was in Illinois. We have tons of cases where people struggled, and it was dangerous work.
Right.
A lot of incident reports from the 1920s involve federal wildlife agents going by themselves with one or two people, stumbling upon illegal activities and being seriously injured. And so it was really dangerous work. And John Perry, through his innovation, actually made it somewhat less dangerous, but highly effective. And I appreciate that about John. So John, in this era, knew that the bootleggers were also what we call duckleggers. So it turned out, just like today, people that have means of smuggling illegal things in the country aren't very discriminating about what they smuggle in. Right? If you
Right.
can smuggle in illegal drugs, you might also be smuggling in illegal wildlife parts, anything that can make a buck, as you said earlier. Well, back in the 20s, turned out that all of these smuggling pathways, these hidden parts and automobiles and trucks and so on that were bringing booze, were also used by people like Al Capone and John Dillinger, all these gangs, to smuggle illegal wildlife, primarily ducks and geese, because there was a huge market and a huge demand and a huge profit to be made by selling these to restaurants and places like Chicago. So the duckleggers took off in the 1920s. Once you have illegal routes and illegal hiding cavities and stuff in cars and that, you can smuggle anything. And then the
Exactly.
challenge was, how do we catch these guys? And John Perry came up with a unique and innovative way to do it that, as far as I can tell, hadn't been used before. Um, it turned out that the duckleggers and bootleggers smuggled all this stuff into Chicago, but it usually came in with one or two people, and they would hire what at the time they called hobos. These were destitute people, often with alcohol problems, that would hang around the waterfront, and they'd pay them a buck or two to unload their trucks. And John Perry knew that. Everybody knew it. And the beauty of hiring these people is there was no real way to trace them, and they didn't testify against anybody. And even if they did, who would listen to them, right? They'd just say, well, this is a drunk person that hangs out at the waterfront. He'll say anything for a buck. So you couldn't really use their testimony in court.
Plus,
So,
in that era, you become a snitch. It's a fast way to
yeah,
get killed.
right. Yeah. Yeah. If
Very
you're
fast
hanging
way
out
to
at the
get killed.
waterfront and you turn them in, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
So Perry's solution was to dress up as a hobo. And he not only was probably the first federal law enforcement agent to go undercover, he also was a method actor to a certain
As
extent.
you know what, as
Yeah,
all anybody who's good at undercover work to some extent is a
he
method
was.
actor. Yeah.
So he took on a whole persona, came up with a new name, went by Dopey, and he would put on the most raggedy sweater. He'd button it wrong, like he buttoned it up drunk on this little sweater. He had a beat up fedora with cigarette burns in it, pressed in on one side. He wouldn't shave for a couple days, and just to make the costume perfect, he would pour some whiskey or rum on
Oh,
his sweater, so he smelled like a drunk, even though he wasn't
perfect.
drinking. He'd hang around the waterfront, and inevitably, he would get picked to help unload illegal wildlife, and he'd be paid $1 or $2. In fact, he commented several times. The gangsters said, "Thanks, Dopey. We'll see you tomorrow with more to
love it.
unload." And
That's
then
awesome.
he'd show up a couple days later, had the crispest uniform I've ever seen, clean shaven, didn't look anything like Dopey the hobo, looked
Right.
totally different, and arrest them. And he said the gangsters never caught on. This was the same person. He called it the old drunk trick, and he had really great success and was never injured seriously during this period. And it really helped break up those rings to a certain extent, at least the ones he was able to arrest. And it was a great innovation. It's something we still do today with our special agents.
100%.
Infiltrate groups. It's dangerous, right? If you ever get caught and so on. But he really kicked it off. And once again, it was something new. Nobody was suggesting you do that, but he was highly effective at it. And we have images. I can share them later for your website, Ed. But
Please.
when you juxtapose how he looked as a hobo to how he looked as the most spit and polish wildlife law enforcement agent you're ever going to see. Yeah, you wouldn't recognize him, right? It was dark. Here's this guy with a fedora, smells of whiskey, just like everybody else unloading the trucks. And then somebody else comes by the next day and catches you in the act. And so John Perry was a real innovator. And I don't know if you've had anybody tell the story, but I think the other great undercover triumph, where we probably were the first, was when we had an agent dress up like a gorilla.
Oh,
I don't think anybody.
we have not told that story on the
I'll
podcast.
hold that off for
It,
somebody else or a
it's
later date.
coming.
But
It's
there
coming.
are.
And we
But
may need your help on that one.
We've had a couple innovative attempts. It just shows, people that go in wildlife law enforcement. It isn't the most traditional
Mm,
law enforcement pathway, and I think we tend to get individuals who
yes.
come into it because they like the environment or because they like the it's odd to say it, but the creativity involved in it. And so we do get a lot of innovations
You know,
in law
we
enforcement.
I think what I've noticed, at least the people I worked with, and it appears to me to be true historically as well, is the best agents and are cops for they think like cops, but they are absolutely dedicated to the mission of the service to protect wildlife. So yeah, they think and they work like cops. They're not biologists carrying a gun. They are cops, but
Right.
they they love the mission and they're dedicated to the mission. So they like work incredible hours. They think outside the box. And one of the things that just fascinates me about John Dopey Perry is unlike current special agents, which, in day-to-day work are plain clothes. They're like FBI agents, make wear a
Right.
tie one day or jeans and a t-shirt the next, but armed, carry handcuffs, firearms, can arrest people, but they're plain clothes officers.
Right.
Back then, John Perry, during his day-to-day activities, was a uniformed officer. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, he
Yeah.
had a uniform and a gun belt and a hat and a badge on his chest. Everybody who saw him out in public would have known, okay, that's a law enforcement officer. But one of the things I really love about him is, and you've mentioned this before, and I've never found anything that contradicts it. I believe John Perry was the very first federal law enforcement officer to do undercover work. It just wasn't done by the feds
It wasn't.
prior to that. And to think, you've got now you have FBI, US Marshals, DEA, HSI, ATF, all these, alphabet agencies with all these incredible histories of doing undercover work. And yet the first guy to do undercover work was a wildlife fed who was looking at duck poaching out of the Midwest.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah. Who even knew about duckleggers, right? All the glory goes to the Untouchables and Elliot Ness, and they made their case through tax evasion.
Exactly.
A much more exciting story.
Totally. And yet John Perry was running around Chicago at the same time. Elliot Ness, all the
Yeah.
other famous, G-men of the era were chasing down John Dillinger and Al Capone. They were all in there contemporaries at the same time, which is just
Yeah.
kind of mind-boggling to think about.
It is mind-boggling. We had one of his colleagues, Ken Rowan, who worked the same time in the 1920s. Once again, I told you Illinois is tough.
Mm,
Rowan never went undercover, but on at least three occasions, he stumbled upon illegal stills in the woods
There you go.
where Capone's gang was brewing up hooch. Basically, if they didn't smuggle it in, they made their own. And he was looking for poachers, but the same place a poacher would be in the middle of nowhere off a dirt road, these stills were, and he was constantly having to have these terrible gunfights where he was outgunned and shot three times, and it was just a rough area. And
Rough
just
time.
like Elliot Ness, I mean, they were going at these gangs in different ways
Right.
to shut them down and developing new techniques
Yeah.
to do it. It's really the people stories are important, and they were a tough breed. The It also makes me thank heavens we have the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC now. that
Exactly.
it's become a much safer profession because there's real training. Back then, with John Perry and Ken Rowan, these old timers, it was kind of you hung out with another law enforcement agent, you were given a book of regulations and kind of sent out there to do your job, and you kind of made it up as you went along. Now
Yeah.
our training is superb, best in the world, and it's made the job safer for our
Yeah,
folks.
I agree. Back then, you probably had to supply your own pistol.
Some of
I'm
them
sure that's
did
true.
because they
I'm
didn't
sure
like
that's
the. In fact, you hear them all excited about getting the newest Colt and so on, and sometimes they buy their own, and sometimes they buy their own uniform components. It was rough.
You know, you mentioned that the other, what was the name of the other officer you mentioned?
Ken
Ed Rowan.
Rowan.
He, stumbling across stills, that sort of thing happens to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agents today. We're investigating a wildlife crime and we come across drug trafficking or human trafficking or, some state violation that's another crime. It happens all the time. One of the
The
things
one fun thing about Ken
yeah,
Rowan, just to show how dangerous this was, that what
yeah.
he and John Perry were doing, he was not only shot a number of times, but at one point his federal vehicle was dynamited.
What?
Yeah, these guys were the gangsters were serious, rotten people, and eventually he was moved to Montana for
Uh,
his safety. But yeah, he went to judges who sometimes were in cahoots with the Capone gang, couldn't get his cases tried, and then when his car was dynamited, that was kind of the last straw for him. He was like,
yeah.
it's time to move on. And the agency agreed. It's like, all right, Ken, time to move you out to Montana, which was a little quieter back then.
Yeah, that's taken things to a new level. We may have to
Yeah,
do a whole episode on Ken. That sounds like an interesting character. I'd never
he's
heard of
quite a
him.
character. He was quite a character.
I'd never heard of him, to be honest with you. That's interesting.
These are some of
You,
the stories we have in the archives
I
that
love
kind
it.
of bring it to life. Yeah.
I love it. You also mentioned that one of Dopey's experiences, John Perry's, was that he would go undercover and then later return in uniform, fully shaved, and the bad guys wouldn't even know it was the same person. I I had that experience in one of my cases. I infiltrated a group of people, hung out with them for 14 months, and when it came time, and I also didn't shave. I had a big mustache, bigger than the
Yeah.
one I have right now. I didn't shower very often. I kind of purposely made myself look dirty. I rubbed the dirt on my hands and face when I would meet them, so it looked like I was, blue collar worker. 14 months later, it came time to arrest everybody. We didn't have enough agents to handle it all, so I had to gear up and participate in the arrests. And so now I'm clean shaven, I'm showered, and I'm wearing our body armor and our raid gear that we wear when we go out and do arrests. And I actually personally arrested one of the guys I had hung out with every weekend for 14 months, and he never knew it was me. He never
Clothes
knew
make the
it was the
man.
same guy. He never knew it
They
was
don't
the same guy.
recognize you.
Yeah, and it kind of was mind-boggling to me. I'm like, I didn't tell him it was me, but I here I am physically putting the handcuffs on him, giving him
Right.
verbal commands. No clue. No clue it was me. It's
Some things stay
unbelievable.
the same.
Yeah, so many things
Barry
are the
was onto
same.
something.
Yeah, and I don't know. I just love that connection between the past and the present, even though, the work, the animals, the people they were dealing with, the technology they had to work with was so different. Yet, if I could sit down at a bar or a restaurant with John Perry today, I'm sure we would see everything in common. It's just
Yeah.
astonishing. Yeah.
Could share stories.
Your stories. I would love to
Yeah.
do that. I'll tell you. There's another guy you mentioned to me that you have a kind of a fondness for, and that was Ray Holland, but I don't know anything about Ray Holland. What can you tell us about him?
Ray Holland is somebody we should all know, and
Okay, great.
he gave his name to one of the most important Supreme Court cases ever, which is something we don't normally get to do in wildlife law enforcement.
No,
So let me tell you about Ray because it's a great story. And
please.
Ray was born in the Midwest, bright young man. Published nature stories as a teenager under the fake name Bob White.
I
It's only a
love.
biologist would come up with. So he loved birds, loved the outdoors. He was so bright. His parents sent him to New Jersey to go to Princeton, but he missed the Midwest birds and the Mississippi River and the wetlands there. So he came back and was a freelance nature writer. Wrote about how birds migrate. Wrote kind of like stuff David Attenborough might do in a documentary. Um, and then
Wait. What era are we talking about? What time frame?
we're talking about early 1900s,
Oh,
1910, right before World War One,
even before John Perry, then.
before John Perry. Yeah, so this is shortly after the Lacey Act, but he's
Okay.
a writer. And then in
Mhm.
1916, well, a couple years before that, we passed the first Bird Protection Act called the Weeks-McLean Act. And that's passed around, I think, 1914, if I recall correctly. And it's the first attempt to outlaw spring hunting of birds. And spring hunting makes no sense because you're killing birds before they have more chicks and more birds.
Right.
So it's a
Right.
poor way to invest in your hunting future.
And it's also while they're trying to nest, right? So
Right,
they're
right.
kind
It's
of
the worst
easy
time to
targets.
hunt them. You're gonna decimate them, and that's what happened. So this law is passed in Congress, but it's difficult to enforce. A number of states rebel against it, and it literally dies in the Supreme Court. It moves up to the Supreme Court, and for some reason, the Supreme Court had a death up there, and the case is just never heard. It's just
Huh.
gone. So the Biological Survey, the law enforcement division says, well, what are we going to do? We passed this law, but nobody really, the states wouldn't enforce it with us, and we don't have many agents. And they come up, here's another innovation.
Mm,
They say, well, the states, sometimes they are slow to accept new laws, especially ones that actually make migratory birds, a federal resource as opposed to a state resource.
right.
But they would have a harder time ignoring a treaty,
Hmm.
international
All right.
treaty.
I know
So I
what's
said, why
coming.
don't we pass a treaty? This all comes out of the Biological Survey. We're a little agency whose job is really to study birds and protect birds. And we have a couple wildlife refuges, but we come up with this idea. Um, the President Wilson at the time says, okay, even though by this point we're in the middle of World War One, there's
Mm,
things going on in Europe. So in 1916, they say, well, why don't we sign a treaty with Canada to try to protect birds that migrate across international borders? Canada makes more sense. It has the biggest border with us. A lot of birds spend their summers in Canada and then come south
right.
for the winter. So, and to give you a sense of how far back this is, when the treaty actually is signed, it's signed by King George V of England.
Of course,
So
right.
Canada
Before
is
Canada
still a
wasn't even
dominion of England.
right.
And England's in the middle of World War One, the First
Man,
World War. They got a lot of other things on their mind, but they think this is important. They sign it. President Wilson signs it, and we have a treaty. It's like great. This treaty signed in 1916. Unfortunately, um, before they can pass enabling legislation. So even when we sign treaties, then we have to pass legislation how we're going to enforce it. We get into World War One. It's
mm,
really busy. We're fighting a world war. We've got boys overseas. It's a tough time. So 2 years later, in 1980, 18, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is passed, and that really transforms our agency. Prior to that, we'd had these Lacey agents, but there weren't very many of them.
right.
Um, and when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is passed, the agency's like, well, we have to hire some new agents to enforce it. Migratory bird treaty agents is what some of them are called initially, on informally duck cops and
Duck up.
informally game protectors and so on. But we don't have anybody to enforce this. it's in the middle of World War One. It's really hard, and so they start looking around. And the chief of our law enforcement remembers this guy who writes all these articles about birds, named Ray Holland. Says, "Well, this he'd be a pretty good law enforcement agent. He knows a lot about birds. He knows the flyways. He knows the Midwest." And by the way, I need an agent to cover 7 states.
Perfect. Oh my gosh.
So this guy's all over the place writing about Illinois to Missouri to Kansas to Iowa. Um, so he offers him a job
Okay.
in these early years, and Ray Holland comes to work for us in the teens, and when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is passed, Holland's ready to really jump in. He says it's great. He can now that the act is passed, he can hunt ducks. He's an avid duck hunter in the fall, and he can hunt poachers in the spring. That's what he's going to do as a law enforcement agent.
Perfect. Perfect.
And so the act is passed, and guess what? The states aren't any happier with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act than they were with the earlier act. They're like, no, this is overreach, and in particular, Missouri is really upset about a lot of ducks, a lot of private hunting clubs in Missouri, and they say the congressional arm cannot reach as far as Missouri to enforce this hated law.
This is a
So,
classic conflict in U.S. Legal history about the the relationship between the federal government and the state governments in
oh
terms of
yeah,
who's got the power and who. Yep, this goes back on a lot of issues, but this is interesting. Okay, so the
yeah.
states are
So this is
balking.
where it starts.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
the states are bulking nowhere more so than Missouri with these sportsmen's clubs, and the attorney general down there, a fellow named Frank McAllister, is the most vociferous because he's going to run for governor. And he
Uh-huh.
says, you know what would be a good issue? I got more duck hunters than I do federal law enforcement agents. So I'm going to run on not enforcing this law. And he even tells the sportsman, if you go out and shoot ducks in the spring, don't worry, we won't prosecute you. We'll even defend you if the federal
Wow.
government comes after you.
Okay.
So Ray Holland knows that this law is important. He really wants to get rid of spring hunting. Remember, he wrote all these articles about how migratory waterfowl breed and feed and the importance of
Right.
letting them alone in the spring. And he decides he's going to go after this attorney general. Because the attorney general is not only saying he's not going to enforce the law, but he says, come
He's a
out with
poacher.
me and I'm going to go shoot a bunch of ducks in the spring and let's
Yeah.
see them come and get me. And
I was
Holland
gonna say he's a
purposely
poacher.
says, I need a big case to let people know because his job, just like today with law enforcement, is split between education and enforcement. So during the hunting season, he goes to every sportsman's club he can and explains about these new laws because they are new, and he explains why they're important. You'll have more ducks in the fall if you don't shoot them in the spring.
Right.
Um, so he needs a big case to educate people about this new law and for them to take it seriously. So he learns that McAllister belongs to a small private club, only 25 people, the oldest club, sportsman's duck hunting club west of the Mississippi. And he goes out there a lot, and that's probably where he's going to go uh, to illegally hunt birds in the spring, like he told the newspapers he was going to do.
Oh boy.
So McAllister goes down to Missouri near the sports hunting club, determined to catch him.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
Holland does. Holland goes down.
Holland does.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Holland goes down there and he's going to catch him and make a big case and then get it tested in the courts.
Hmm.
But there's a problem. It's a private club with 25 members.
Right.
How does he get on it?
Right.
And he audaciously takes a cab from the train station and says, take me to the sportsman's club. And the guy says, it's a private club with gates and all that. He goes, oh, yeah, yeah. No, I'm one of them. I'm a member here. And the guy says, well, you don't have any guns to hunt with. He tells the cab driver, oh, no, McAllister took all the firearms out there. And the cabbie tells him, yeah, when they went out the other day, they had a big enough armory for the whole state of Missouri.
Beautiful.
So he knows they're going to go hunting. So he goes out there early in the morning. The hunt club, the lodge is empty. They're all out in a blind. shooting birds illegally, and he and another agent go out and arrest them.
Unbelievable.
And they have tons of birds. There's about 50 illegally hunted birds back at the lodge, probably from the previous day. And then there's a bunch more. He watches them for a while, sees how many they take out, and it's like, that's enough. We've got a case.
Yeah.
Really, they only had to shoot one,
Right.
basically,
Right.
but he
Right. Right.
wanted a strong case.
Yeah.
So he,
Show the egregious behavior, right?
yeah, and it just gets worse.
Yeah.
These are bad, bad hombres. They really are. So he takes him back to the lodge and says, you're under arrest. There's this migratory bird, treaty act, which, assuming you're the attorney general of Missouri, about, you've spoken about it. And the attorney general goes ballistic
I'll
and
bet he
says,
does.
you can't arrest the attorney general. I'm the chief law enforcement official of the state of Missouri. And this is never going to stick. And you're out of luck. The people he's with, the other hunt club members, they're a little less vociferous. They start offering Ray Holland jobs
Oh yeah, the
in the
bribe.
life
Yep.
insurance company that one of them owns. Well, maybe you could come work here as an investigator. We pay really well. Another guy tries to bribe him, but he
Oh,
doesn't have any witnesses, so he just drops all. He says, well, I'm taking you to the judge. The
nice.
first judge he goes to, McAllister, goes right up to him and says, hey, Judge, how you doing? They know each other, but the judge doesn't care. Judge is sick of McAllister flouting the law and says, hey, you guys, you committed a crime, you're going to be charged with this.
Nice.
And of course, McAllister defends himself and starts fighting it through the courts. And then both McAllister and Holland know it's going to go to the Supreme Court because it's a big decision. It's going to keep being appealed. And it does. It takes a while. So the law is passed in 1918 in the summer. Of course, McAllister didn't waste any time. In the spring of 1919, as soon as he could violate the law, he went out there and shot probably 100 plus waterfowl, half
Wow.
of which were put in a cold storage unit. And then McAllister managed to get those removed and given to a mental asylum and eaten. So that evidence was gone,
Wow.
but Holland had kept the other evidence and goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Big deal. So we have
Yeah.
a Supreme Court called Missouri versus Holland, which on the face of it looks like it's the state of Missouri taking on a European nation, but it's not. It's Ray Holland.
It's Ray Holland. Ray Holland, this poor federal wildlife officer
Yeah,
who's the first to kind of go after enforcing the Migratory
go
Bird
after a
Treaty Act,
big, yeah. So it
ends
goes
up with his
all the
name on a
way.
U.S. Supreme Court case. I
I
love it.
know.
I love it.
Goes all the way up to the Supreme Court by 1920. It wends its way through the courts. By then, Holland has actually left our agency.
Hmm.
Holland has a growing family. Law enforcement agents aren't paid particularly well. He's having a hard time supporting himself, and he takes his job so seriously he doesn't have time to write articles anymore, which was an
Right.
important source of income for him. So he's given the job. This is a real job, not a bribe job, of being editor of the newsletter for the American Game Propagation Association. That's a wildlife agency trying to protect game. So he's in New York, but the case is going on. The Biological Survey is pursuing the case. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the decision is written by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., probably the most famous Supreme Court justice ever.
Yeah.
And Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. is not particularly sympathetic to the Attorney General of Missouri, who's flouting the law, not only violating the law, but openly flouting it and using it as a campaign issue to run for governor. So he notes, this idea about um, state rights versus federal rights, first of all, had kind of already been decided in the recently ended Civil War,
Right.
other things,
Right.
and comes up with the supremacy clause that says, international treaties are the supreme law of the land. So we can't make a treaty with Canada and then have Wisconsin say, I'm not going to abide by that treaty. It's international. And then he goes on to give a very wholehearted appreciation for conservation, and that's probably the most numerous or the most important thing. It's a Supreme Court decision that could have been written by Theodore Roosevelt or John Muir or Aldo Leopold. And he says, um, just because these birds land in your state or your country doesn't mean you have the right to deprive other people of ever having the chance to see them or hunt them or appreciate them in any way. That's not the way it works. They're a international resource and a national resource that belongs to all of the American people and should be protected for future generations. So he didn't just narrowly look at the law and say, "Hey, it's a treaty.
Right.
You got to obey it." He really made a strong conservation effort in his decision, and that it transformed our agency. And that the reality is there's so many species that migrate across international boundaries, state boundaries, county boundaries. The only way to protect those type of species, or you think about oceanic species
Yeah.
too, is to have overarching protection for them. And it really, after that, there aren't any more challenges. And initially, it looked like almost all the states along the Mississippi weren't going to enforce it. And that was a major flyway, a major
Mhm.
prairie pothole region. And it transforms our agency. A lot of the conservation work we do since then, all the way up through the Endangered Species Act, that precedent is set in 1920 with the Missouri versus Holland. So one agent who worked for us for a relatively short period of time
Huge.
changed conservation history. And, every first year law student
Yeah.
reads Missouri versus Holland. I don't know if any of them know that Ray Holland was a game protector whose
I
job was
didn't.
to cover 7 states and spent most of his time, giving fines to spring hunters illegally shooting waterfowl. And it's a great story. One man can make a difference.
Like it is
Mhm.
an awesome story. And you know what? I went to law school and I did not know at the time that that came out of a wildlife case. I think that's just
Yeah.
brilliant. I love
My
it.
wife is a lawyer and she studied it too. And it was like, I was like, hey, that has a history behind it. She goes, well, we didn't cover that.
No, not at all. It was,
Oh,
in
no.
law school is all about, the supremacy clause of the U.S.
Right.
government. When there's a conflict between federal and state law, federal controls. That's what you'd study in law school. You don't study the background of the conservation issue. And when you were describing what the justice said, Oliver Wendell Holmes, it just sounds so much like the second guest I ever had on this podcast was a retired special agent named Cash Schrieffer, who worked in the southeastern U.S. on a lot of migratory bird issues, and could have been Cash speaking when you were
Yeah.
talking about what the justice said. It's that's unbelievable, and the unsung heroes. I didn't even know who Ray Holland was till you brought him up to me when we were talking about you being on this episode, and it's just incredible. Just think how many more people are out there who accomplished amazing things who we don't know about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things we try to do in the archive and museum. And in my job is to unearth these stories and realize um, how impressive your predecessors were at
Mhm. Mhm.
and inspire people to do great things themselves too, right? If these guys could do it in 1918, the 1920s, with, as you noted, very little technology,
Mhm.
very few agents to carry out these laws. Imagine what we can do today with much better training, uh, much better support as an agency, and these precedents that came before us.
Exactly. Yeah. Never forget where you came from, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I just can't tell you how thankful I am that you're there and that you do what you do because I'm a hardcore I was a hardcore dedicated agent. I believe in the
I know
mission.
you were.
It means a lot to me to be able to learn about what other people have done and who's gone before me, and wouldn't happen without your efforts. So I really appreciate it. Um, we talked a little bit about this, but you were talking about how dangerous it was back at that
Yeah.
time. In the 20s, there were a lot of shootouts involving not only state game officers, but federal game officers. A lot of
Right.
officers were killed, seriously injured, a lot of gunfire. Um, we're at some point in this podcast, I'm going to do a whole episode on, or a series of episodes. I haven't decided how it's going to go. I will for sure use you for some help but we're going to do a series of episodes about officers who were either killed or injured in the line of duty, going back to the earliest days, and tell their stories in hopefully a very engaging, like, storytelling way that will take people right there back to whatever it was, 1920, 1918, 1940. At some point, our agency, you mentioned, had the title of the officers had changed to game management agent. And
Correct.
this was before we became special agents, but we were still federal agents, focused a lot on Lacey Act and migratory birds.
Mhm.
The last time we had an agent shot in the line of duty was actually 1962. It was a guy
Wow.
named Vic Blazovic. Did you ever have occasion to talk to Vic, or do you know much about him?
I do not know a lot about Vic at all. I know he was shot. I did not know he was the last agent. I'm happy he was the last. We've had a good run for the last 60 years or so, but I don't really know the story about Vic.
When I came out of the academy in 2003, I didn't know anything about him. Never learned. When we were at the academy, or at the time, there was no section on history of our agency or our agents. Anything you picked up, it was just kind of from a lucky meeting with you, Mark, or somebody said something. And I don't even know where I heard about it, but a few years after I became an agent, I heard that one of our agents had been shot, and I actually looked him up. He was retired, and I called him, and I
Oh,
said, "Hey,
wow.
I'm a new agent. I just heard for the first time that you were shot in the line of duty. Tell me the story." And it's an incredible story. And Mark, I'm gonna tell the story from what I know, having talked
Yeah.
to Vic and having done some research about it. I'll make sure I send you everything I've got about it. But
Yeah.
it's an
Please.
incredible story. The guy ended up being ambushed and shot multiple times, survived, continued his career, went on to become the special agent in charge of investigations at
Wow.
headquarters before he retired. He died in 2008, but I fortunately had a chance to talk to him on the phone. So if it's all right with you, I'm going to tell that story.
I would love to hear it. I always like learning new histories.
Awesome. Mark Madison, historian at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Everything you do for the service is so important, and I want you to know that you are valued by not just the agents of the Fish and Wildlife Service, but all of the employees, and I think by the people of the United States for what you do. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate the chance to get to speak to folks.
Hey, I will give you an opportunity anytime you want to come on the show.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
All right,
Everybody,
Ed.
thanks for tuning in. Take care. Nature's Secret Service is written and produced by me, Ed Newcomer, and is co-produced by the DHTV team here at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Follow us on social media and connect with us online at naturesecretservice.com.